Jonathan, could I ask you to lead us in a word of prayer, please? Thank you very much, sir. All right, now, we may very well conclude our study on Jude. If someone would, please read Jude 24 and 25, please. Jude 24 and 25. Maybe we're back. 24 and 25. Jude 1, 24 and 25. So today, if we have, and I picked this up, I'm going to steal it from somebody, but if we have a bullet point, a target that we're shooting for today, we need to understand that today, you know where I got it from, today is we need to shoot for understanding that God is able. If we are to, we must trust that God can sustain us through trying times. And so here in the conclusion of the letter, he reaches a high point. And this was, this is normally the case that you reach a literary climax at the end of the letter through the Bible, but this was clearly the case with Jude's letter. And Jude began with a prayer for mercy, peace, and love to be multiplied among the faithful remnants of the believers, because again, this congregation that he was writing this letter to had false teachers moving in. And what he was saying is, if you're going to need unity to fulfill the charge to contend for the faith, once everything has been delivered unto the saints. And so Jude is encouraging, he's exhorting his readers to not be discouraged and not be dissuaded by false teachers who had infiltrated their congregation. He's encouraged them that regardless of how things looked at the moment, the ungodly will not prevail in the end. And we need to remember that each and every day that we walk through this world, is that we need to understand that the ungodly will not prevail in the end. It's only a matter of time that the people that he's talking about when he's addressing this congregation and the people that we think of, they will be punished for the harm that they do the church. And so Jude is providing his readers with practical counsel on how to stand up, how to endure, and how to do so triumphantly, victoriously in those difficult days. If we think about, do we face difficult days? Do we face difficult days in the church? Are there people out there that are preaching and teaching things that don't line up with the Bible? Absolutely. And we that God will sort them out in the end. And last but not least, Jude pointed them to the power of God to sustain them in the midst of change and crisis in the church. God is there. He is working with us for our benefit so that we can know a home with him in heaven. And he concluded in his writings with a comforting prayer on behalf of these battle-weary saints. He's telling them the struggle is too important to compromise. It's too important to surrender. And even though you may be worn down, you must continue the good fight to the very end. And where could they find this strength? Oh, come on, guys. Thank you. In God. You can look to God to find this strength when you need it. Christians can count on God when the going gets tough. And so, somebody read verse 24 again. You can stop right there. Him who is able. Who's he talking about? God. Jude began his prayer with this memorable phrase, now to him who is able. You know, I want you to think about, when you think about God who is able, think about God and his history with his chosen covenant people. You know, do the words he is able, does it bring about visions of everything that he had done for the children of Israel throughout their time? You know, time and time again, the Lord rescued them from their enemies, and he blessed them in their obedience. Now, we have looked at when they weren't obedient, there was no blessings to be found, but when they were obedient, he blessed them in their obedience. You know, there's two examples that come to mind. First of all, you know, you think about, and both of these examples, and there's many examples that come to mind, but these examples that I'm talking about today come from the book of Daniel. You know, in that first incident, we're all familiar with the account of when Nebuchadnezzar erected a 90-foot golden statue, and all these high officials throughout the empire gathered for the day of dedication. And every person in attendance was under this imperial decree to bow down and to worship this image when the royal musicians played their trumpets or played their instruments. And the penalty for not complying with this command was death. And it was death by fire. And I look back, I said it was death, and death by fire. I look back, and Renee's just smiling and laughing. I don't know. I love you, Renee. I got to pick on you. All right, so anyway, the death was by fire. A furnace on site would provide the scene for execution for the guilty. And so the orchestra sounded and the multitude bowed down before the statue, and the ceremony seemed flawless until this group of Chaldeans approached the king and accused these three young Jews of disloyalty. And it was reported that they refused to worship the king's golden idol. And the names of the accused were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. At least that was their Hebrew names. You know them better. We know them more commonly as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And encouraged by the character of their fellow captive Daniel, who, by the way, his Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. Can you imagine just, you know, getting that out, you know? That's why we call him Daniel. And they refused to violate their consciousness, their conscience by breaking God's commandments. And because God had commanded not to worship idols, Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through 5. And so they understood that there would be a penalty exacted for their integrity. They knew that they were facing punishment for not bowing down to this statue, but it was a price that they were prepared to pay. These young men displayed uncommon composure when summoned before the king, because they knew that they were in dire straits, but they also knew that God was with them, and their humble confidence must have impressed some onlookers, while it certainly got under the skin and enraged some others. And the king was willing to consider this incident just a simple misunderstanding. He was willing to grant his valued servants a second chance. He was willing, he explained to them that all would be forgiven if they would just bow down before the golden image when the instruments were sounded. But if not, they would be executed within the hour. Nebuchadnezzar concluded with this challenge. And listen to this, because and he changes his tune later on, but this question causes me to shiver. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Daniel 3:15. Nebuchadnezzar is asking, who is this God that you worship that will deliver you from me? He's going to find out. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they responded instantly to the king's threats, and they did it with such poise and such composure, and they proclaimed, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. Daniel 3:17. Well, what do you think this did to Nebuchadnezzar? It infuriated him. He was burning with anger. He was just incensed. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't order that the furnace be fired up. No, he did, but he ordered that it be fired up and heated 7 times hotter than usual. Now, I want you to think about that. We all just come through Thanksgiving. How many of y'all used your ovens? How many of y'all got down there and checked that turkey and that warm air just hit you in the face and dried your eyes out? And maybe some of us got a little too close, and maybe we got a little bit less eyebrows this morning. 7 times hotter than usual. And these defiant Jews, they were bound. They were tied up, and they were thrown into the fire. But the soldiers that were in charge of this execution, they were also engulfed by the inferno. And Nebuchadnezzar watched with astonishment. He watched in disbelief that would soon become very much belief at what happened next. And instead of succumbing to the flames, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could be seen just casually walking around in the furnace, walking around in the fire. And you know what? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and there was a 4th figure in the fire with the appearance of that of an angel. And when the king ordered them out of the furnace, they came out and they weren't singed. We can't cook a turkey where we don't burn off a little bit of face hair. They were not singed. They did not smell of smoke. And Babylon's king, at that point where he had asked, who is this God that will deliver you from my hand? He is now saying the blessed name of the Hebrews' God, and passed a decree calling for the death of anyone who dared to speak against the Lord. In his actions, Nebuchadnezzar declared, there is no other God who can deliver like this. Daniel 3:29. And instead of death or dismissal, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were promoted by the king for their courageous stand. We have got to trust that God is there with us, that he is thinking of us, that he loves us, and that he will be there for us in our times of trials and despairs. Another example from the book of Daniel, this time dealing with Daniel. Sometime later, after what we had just described, there was a similar incident. Because of Daniel's character, because of Daniel's competence, he rose rapidly through the political ranks, and God caused him to prosper until he was next in line to become the highest appointed public official by the king of Persia. Now, is there jealousy in political realms? Oh, I'm sorry, what? Everybody's chuckling. Well, this caused his political rivals to be jealous. And this caused his political rivals to conspire to unseat him, because not only were they jealous of him, but he was a foreigner to them. And so this just surpassed embarrassment to them. And what I'm talking about can be found in Daniel chapter 6. And so after an extensive investigation, Daniel's enemies were unable to find anything compromising. No compromising or embarrassing information about his administrative affairs, about how he did his job, about his personal life. They didn't stop. Rather than abandoning this scheme, they decided to manufacture the badly needed evidence. You know, we see this with Christ. You couldn't find anything when Christ was put on trial. They couldn't find anything to say that was legitimate, that he had done wrong, and so they just manufactured the evidence. And and we see that even to this day. And so they needed this evidence so badly that they cooked it up. And settling upon religion as their point of attack, they put together this plan. And so they went to King Darius, and they were appealing to his ego, if you will, and pretending to admire the king, and they encouraged him to declare a decree that there would be a 30-day ordinance outlawing prayers to anyone but the emperor. Oh, and King Darius, he was so flattered by their proposal that he signed it into law, what they would hope would be Daniel's death warrant, because, of course, who's Daniel going to pray to? And so anyone that violated this order would be cast into the den of lions. And as soon as Daniel heard about this decree, what did he do? He was unfazed. He went home, he opened his window towards Jerusalem, and he knelt down in prayer, giving thanks to God, because it was his custom to do so and pray in this manner 3 times a day. And he was determined not to change a thing. Everything we read about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and everything that we're hearing about Daniel, think about how we stack up. Think about, do we even compete? I can tell you Van Herndon needs some work. But he was determined not to change a thing. He refused to be coerced into denying God and living a life of deception. So when these jealous officials learned that Daniel continued his religious routine, they approached the king to inform him of Daniel's infraction. And rather than being upset with his friend, Darius was rather angry with himself because he had been duped by Daniel's adversaries. And he worked feverishly. He was desperate to find a loophole in the law, but see, he had signed this decree and there was no avail. He could not get around it, because according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no edict signed by the king could be altered or annulled, and he couldn't even stop what he had set in motion. And so that night, Daniel was arrested, and he was cast into the lion's den, and a stone was placed over the opening and sealed with the signet of the king and his lords. And Darius did not eat or sleep that night. And at first light, he hastily returned to the den of the lions, and he called to his friend, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? Daniel 6:20. And then he heard from the lion's den Daniel's voice. And Daniel explained that because of his innocence, the Lord had sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions. And after he was removed from danger, guess what? These people that had devised this scheme against Daniel, well, they were put in the lion's den. And where the angel had shut the mouths of the lions for Daniel, these gentlemen got their just deserts because they were devoured by the lions. And Darius wrote a new decree and sent it throughout the empire. His proclamation called for people everywhere to fear the God of Daniel. He explained the bestowal of this honor by declaring, he delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Daniel 6:27. So there's just two examples from the book of Daniel where God was with his people. And we, brethren, need to remember that God is with us today. You know, what God did historically for Israel by delivering them from their enemies was a sign of what he can do on man's behalf spiritually. The Lord liberated his covenant people from tyranny, from oppression, from great political powers, great military powers like Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Rome, and he is no less capable of freeing those in bondage to Satan and releasing them from the terrible consequences of their slavery to sin. So when we see the phrase, to him who is able, Jude is calling your mind to the proof that is provided by history of God's trustworthiness, even in the toughest times. Just as the Lord vindicated the faith of Daniel and of his friends, Jude's readers, he is encouraging them to trust the Lord to support them in their stand for truth. So when facing enemies, when feeling that all is lost, brethren, never underestimate the ability of God to intervene providentially and bless those who put their confidence in him. You know, the New Testament has references as well. They're not just limited to the Old Testament. You know, the Lord is praised 3 times in the New Testament as God who is able. Romans 16:25. Somebody read it, please. Who is able. Paul glorified God as one who is able, one who has the power to establish men and women by the gospel. Somebody read Ephesians 3:20. To him who is able. Paul praised God in prayer as the one who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. And then this third commendation where God is able is in the New Testament, and of course what we're talking about here in Jude today. So what is God able to do? Let's have a little bit of discussion briefly. What is God able to do? If you go back and read our verse today. Yes.
He said, if God can do all that with these great nations, how much more will he do within you?
Absolutely. And understand too, where the Hebrew children, where the children of Israel, the Hebrews was God's chosen covenant people, but that was to bring forth Christ. Who is God's chosen people now? Christians. And so he stood by his people then, and he stands by his people now. And each one of us, if we trust in him, we can be a great tool to his cause. And so, what are some other things what are some things that God is able to do? Look at the verse and see if you can glean some insight from that. Jude 24 and 25. Very good. All right, he can keep you from stumbling. Jude wanted his readers to remember about God's ability, and the first thing he wanted them to remember is God is able to keep you from falling. The Greek word in this, it refers to a sure-footed horse. God can make sure that his people are sure-footed spiritually if they trust him. Jude was saying that God has the means to keep his people from falling away if they avail themselves of it. God has wisdom. But James says men have to ask in a believing prayer, James 1, 5 through 6. God has spiritual armor to protect his soldiers, but they must put it on, Ephesians 6. The image of following away suggests that Christians living is like walking through dangerous territory en route to a destination. Those who walk with God can travel safely, even when the terrain is at most treacherous. Somebody read Psalm 121, 3. He will not allow your foot to be moved. He will not allow your foot to be moved. When climbing a mountain, and inexperienced, I feel like Lonnie Jones talking about this. You get it. When climbing a mountain, an inexperienced climber is bound by a rope. He's tied by a rope to his guide. And if he falls, the lifeline will keep him from plunging to his death. Actually, I have a personal story that I hadn't thought about when I was prepping this lesson. I'm going to share it now if y'all would like to be indulged. Do y'all know that when I was at the sheriff's office, I went rappelling one time? One of my colleagues had some contacts out of Montgomery County with the rescue squad up there, and they wanted to come down here to Crane's Landing, and they wanted to go rappelling because there's a cliff. And they're like, Van, why don't you come? And I was too young and inexperienced and stupid to go, no, that's probably not a good idea. And so anyway, we showed up at the top of the cliff, and they were like, all right, put your foot through this, put your foot through that, tighten this, all right, here's what you do. And I'm like, okay. And I go over the edge, and I'd seen it on TV, and so they're like, just push out with your legs and then swing back in. And I'm like, okay. And so I'm holding up here, and I'm holding this rope back here, and I push out, and I fly out, and I'm going, and I come back in, and they're like, oh, and I'm not bragging, hold it, because you wait till the end of the story. But right then, the guy that I was with, and understand too, this rope back here, if you put tension on it, it tightens up in the descender and causes you to brake, where you slow down and then stop. But if you can't, there's a guy at the bottom called your belay man. Just remember that, because if you can't put tension on that rope, he's there to do it for you. And so that's why it's relevant to what we're talking about here, but anyway, and so they were like, no, you're duping us. You've done this before. And I pushed, they go, do it again. I pushed out again. Well, when I come back in, my feet hit something that wasn't solid. And of course, I don't know if y'all have noticed this or not, but I'm a little top heavy. I'm a little bit heavier at the top than I am at the bottom. And so them feet of mine just went, phew, and my head went, phew, and this rope just disappeared. And let me tell you something. The word belay becomes the only word in your vocabulary, because at that point, that's the signal to the guy at the bottom of the face of the cliff to pull on that rope. And I'm like, I'm hearing that rope going through that descender going, and I'm like, belay, belay. And I hear the rope go, and I'm like, no, belay, belay. And finally, he got me stopped, and I'm just out from, and at the bottom of the cliff, there was an outcrop, and so he couldn't be right up against the face. So I was just dangling out in the air, my feet just, I looked like a floating cockroach on my back. But here's the thing. My life was bound to that belay guy, and without that belay guy, I would have went splat. Top heavy or not, everything would have hit. And it's falling ain't what kills you, stopping. That's what gets you. And my life was tied to that belay guy. And I'm sad to say this, I can't even remember his name, but I owe him a debt. All joking aside, because the spectacle is funny, and obviously I'm here to tell about it, so it's okay to laugh, but it could have gone very differently. And think about this. We've got to have God as our belay guy. We've got to be tied to God. We need God. We need to make sure that God has his hand on our rope. A small child goes out and starts playing in the ice, walking down an icy sidewalk. Well, the parent's there to hold its hand. Well, and of course, we talked about this. Parents don't like parents don't like rules. Children don't like rules. And so the child's pulling against you. Well, you're holding on to the child to keep the child from hurting himself. Well, if you let go, what's going to happen? He's going to get out there and look like a newborn foal, and then he's going to just land on the ice, and he's going to bust it all over the ice. And then, once he does that, what's he going to do? He's going to look back and go, can I have your hand? Maybe that was a good idea. We need to make sure that we are holding on to God's hand, that we are in a position to where we make sure that God's hand is on the rope, because he's going to hold on to the rope for us, but we've got to make sure that we don't get in his way. We've got to understand that the rules that are set forth by the Bible, that is not a hindrance, it's a help. And we need to understand, we in here as humans have outgrown, well, some of us have, I don't know, at 48, I don't know that I have outgrown the need for the guidance of their parents. Understand, as Christians, we never outgrow the need for the guidance that is provided by our Heavenly Father. Because, brethren, saints are surrounded by stumbling blocks on a daily basis as we walk through life. There is hypocrisy, there is false teaching, and these are just some of the many obstacles that Satan places in people's way to trip us up, to trip Christians up. And so these obstacles, these impediments, they're plentiful and they're difficult, but God is able to help Christians overcome them all. And so how does he do it? Well, the first way is the providence of God. This is an important part of the process. Paul promised, God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. The Lord has told us that a person will not be tempted beyond his or her ability to say no. Peter added, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment, 2 Peter 2:9. Those who are genuinely seeking a way out of potential dangerous situations can count on God to provide an avenue of escape. But it's our responsibility to use it. If we have a certain temptation.
Back on Ephesians 3:20, it says, now to him who ourselves in that situation of relying and trusting on Him, because He will do, go above and beyond for us, but we have to meet Him there as well.
Absolutely.
So that's how I take that verse as well, is that we have to have that trust and that instinct of us to rely on Him to provide that for us.
So for those who are home couldn't hear on the live stream, but Ethan made a good point. And two things that I gleaned from that. First of all, it's hard for us to wrap our head around how God helps us. And then second of all, we have to understand that we have a responsibility. We live in a time where miraculous gifts, miracles have gone away. They've served their purpose. One of the, I often say the 4 purposes of a miracle, and I stole this from somebody, is to verify Christ's deity, to verify a true apostle, to verify the true word of God, and to fulfill prophecy. And once all that was done, the miracles went away. And actually, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where he's talking about love, at the end, it was when I was a child I did with childish things. But, and that whole thing, we call it the love chapter, but it's actually how, what's more important, miraculous gifts or love? And he's it is the love chapter, but he's dealing with their squabbles over who had the better miraculous gifts. And then he makes the point that those things will go away. And those things went away because the church was being established, and when the church was fully formed and God's word was fully delivered, then you had no need for miracles anymore. So we don't live in a miraculous age. God does work in our lives providentially, but he works in our lives through natural ways, not miraculous or supernatural ways. And so I think, to your point, we have miracles. They're recorded in the Bible. But I made this point last week. We're 2,000 years removed, and so I think that allows us to become complacent. It allows us to not fully appreciate with the awe that we should what God can do, because we're reading about it. We're 2,000, but brethren, we've got to get in the Word. We've got to understand, because we sometimes are guilty of reading, like Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, and we read that with about as much excitement as the credit card bill. I don't know. I've had some pretty exciting credit card. No, anyway, stop it. Anyway, but all joking aside, we need to, that is a huge thing. I mean, Christ had the power to raise a man from the dead, and we don't give it the attention that it needs. And so that's one of the things I think that goes in is we don't fully appreciate what God can do, because we've allowed ourselves to become kind of desensitized. And we need to make sure that we appreciate these accounts in the Bible for all that they should inspire. And then, yes, we absolutely, Ethan, you've got to, you've got to realize that you have a responsibility. I've heard it said before, if you're going to pray for rain, don't leave the house without an umbrella. Because what does that say about your faith? Well, I wish it would rain. I pray that it would rain. And then you don't go out prepared. What are you saying about your belief in that prayer? You're just going through the motions. So thank you for that insight. I tell you what, we've only got about 3 minutes. We're going to have one more week. Any questions? We'll cut it off right there. Thank you, Ethan, for that. Yeah. And just in the belly of a great fish for 3 days. I mean, that's just, And also, brethren, and you kind of touched with that example, you kind of touched on something. Understand the story of Jonah is not just a prophet in the belly of a whale or of great fish for 3 days. Understand that is a story about obeying God. And, you know, he was told to go to Nineveh, and that's a story about hatred. And that's a story about hatred leading to disobedience. You know, he was told to go to Nineveh. He went to Tarshish. Tarshish was the exact opposite direction. He went about as far away from God as he could. And so I have this thing about don't just, as much as I love what you said, and I'm not saying anything, I'm telling for us adults out here, it's appropriate for them down there. But as we adults grow, we need to understand that it's more than just a great fish. It's a story about obedience and doing God's will and what happens when you don't do God's will. And he went about as far away as he could by headed to Tarshish as he could away from God because of the hatred in his heart. And that is the ultimate story. And we can't put that on a coloring sheet and expect a 4-year-old to get it. And so that's appropriate. But for us out here, understand that there's so much more to the story of Jonah. And we need to fully, you know, and I'm not picking on anything you said. It's just one of those things with me is because, you know, I mean, quite frankly, I was in my 30s. I'm like, oh, wow, there's so much more to this book. and I just had that childlike because of, you know, so we get them acquainted with those, you know, I feel like I agree with everything you said, but let me add that to it. Yeah. Yeah.
And you do get it as you know, have a different understanding for it. So, but the excitement is not there, though, as it should be. Like it is down that hall.
And when we read these things, you know, we should be, you know, I mean, they're written for our learning, but for us to fully learn, we need to put ourselves as somebody that's standing on the side of the road. You know, I mean, you know, you think about, we read about Zacchaeus, or not, we read about Jesus making his way to Golgotha, to Calvary, and you know, and we think about Zacchaeus, you know, we need to be Zacchaeus. We need to be, you know, we don't just need to read it. We need to be there, you know, visualizing this, because, you know, if you think about, because everything is given to us, you know, how he was beaten, and the physical condition that he was in, and he was still able to make that, you know, and just the pain that he suffered, you know, and you think about all that, if you think about all that, you might not be as quick to stumble. So, thank you, Jenny. Thank y'all. Hope you got something out of that. Love you.